I'm Jane Harmon, the very bossy president and CEO of the Wilson Center. Somebody has to do it. Come on, Sander. Tracy, let's go. Okay, Chuck, everyone. Kathy, you can sit there, right there. Kathy, sit there. Is everyone listening? Are you impressed yet? I would like to welcome the slowly moving Wilson board and our cabinet, our council, corporate council, and a number of ambassadors who have been here at lunch and are here now. Thank you very much. Ambassador of Colombia, Luis Carlos Villegas Echeverri, Ambassador of Chile, Juan Gabriel Valdez, Ambassador of Gabon, Michael Musa Adamo, and Ambassador of Nicaragua, Francisco Campbell. Did I leave anyone out? No. Who could have guessed that oil prices would slide as much as they did in 2014? And yet the geopolitical implications are huge for Iran, Russia, Nigeria, and for nations here in the Americas. A barrel of crude is never just a barrel of crude. Falling oil prices contributed to last year's biggest diplomatic and security stories. And we can't expect anything less in 2015. Oil is deeply embedded in the way the world does business and conducts foreign policy. So energy markets have a stake and a say in things like nuclear negotiations with Iran, in efforts to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, in Nigeria's elections, and in hopes for American energy independence. The Wilson Center's Jan Kaliki, right there. There are 2 empty seats here for anyone who isn't sitting yet. Jan is all by himself and quite lonely. Told an audience last October at our first event on this subject that predicting long-run oil prices is a fool's errand. But if anyone's likely to... Oh, Joe Gildenhorn, wonderful. Come along. We'll move in some direction so that Joe can sit somewhere near the front. Come on down. I wasn't sure you were coming. Joe, come on this end. Come over here. We want to show everybody how you're back in action. Okay, right here. Andrew, you can, if Alma's not here, Andrew, come back. Okay, here we go. Anyway, if anyone's likely to get the question about oil prices right, it will be the people in this room. We're proud today to present 2 panels whose speakers represent some of the world's most important energy economies: Colombia, Canada, Iran, Russia, and Nigeria. Our own scholars will moderate. First, guiding a conversation on North and Latin America, we have David Biette, director of our Canada Institute. Mexico Institute director Duncan Wood will participate as a panelist. Both have been deeply involved in urgent dialogues on North American energy. Later, Kennan Institute director Matt Rojansky will lead a talk on Russia, Nigeria, and the Persian Gulf. Both panels are in capable hands, and I will let our moderators introduce their speakers. But first, let me just say that it's appropriate that this conversation happen here in the United States, which was in 2014, drum roll, the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas liquids. Not too shabby and not something anybody here imagined 10 years ago. It testifies to the rapid changes coming over the energy market, and especially the revolution in unconventional reserves, that the U.S. now has as much riding on oil and gas prices as any other producer. Earlier this year, Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz was here to offer his perspective on the energy outlook. Today, we offer a global perspective. Just one moment of shameless self-promotion, as our Vice President for New Initiatives, Aaron Miller, often says. This is what the Wilson Center does best. We do deep dives into current, relevant policy issues, bridging deep scholarship and civil conversation. That's why we've moved up the think tank ratings from number 11 when I joined 4 years ago to number 5 with the help of the village called the Wilson Center. And we're climbing. We've received special recognition for our cross-disciplinary programming, which today's event definitely is. We have 4 policy programs to thank today. And I'd like to single out especially David Biette and the Canada Institute for making today's event a reality and a big success. Please join me. Alma, there's a seat here next to somebody named Joe Gildenhorn in the front. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you, Jane. I'm David Biette. I'm director of the Center's Canada Institute and coordinator of its relatively new Polar Initiative. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Falling Oil Prices, Changing Implications for Global Producers. As Jane mentioned, this is a Pan-Wilson Center event hosted by the Africa Program, the Canada Institute, the Kennan Institute, the Latin American Program, the Mexico Institute, the Middle East Program, and the Regional and Global Energy Series. As you surely know, the last 8 months have seen a dramatic drop in the price of oil across all benchmarks worldwide. In June of 2014, Brent topped $110 a barrel. Now it's trading at just over $50. This dramatic fall has had wide-ranging effects throughout the globe. Today, the Wilson Center has assembled a prestigious group of panelists from various oil-producing areas around the world to discuss how their region is reacting to the fall in oil prices and what potential solutions and various governments and companies might use to stem the tide of red ink. Our first panel will feature Alfonso Cuellar, the president and managing director of Hill & Knowlton Strategies in Colombia. Alfonso will discuss what low prices mean for South America with specific focus on Colombia and we hope a little on Venezuela. Next, John Rozhon, president of Oakleaf Energy Trading and senior researcher at the Canadian Energy Research Institute, otherwise known as CERI, is visiting us from Calgary. John will discuss what low prices mean for Canada, for Alberta, and for the oil sands industry. Finally, a familiar face, Duncan Wood at the far end, director of the Mexico Institute here at the center. Duncan will talk about what this low price environment means for Mexico's energy reforms and its national budget. Our second panel today will focus on Russia, Iran and the Persian Gulf, and Africa. My colleague Matthew Rajansky, director of the Center's Kennan Institute, will moderate that panel and will introduce those speakers after the break. So, we are live tweeting this event using the hashtag #PoundFallingOil. So join in the conversation, and we will be taking questions from the overflow room. There are, my colleagues there will be passing out cards and give them, and they will be run up here so we can get those questions here too. And if you're participating via the webcast or Twitter, send in your question via Twitter and we'll get those up here as well. So, over to Alfonso. Let's begin.
Good afternoon. It is great to be back in Washington, D.C. If there's one thing I learned during my 4 years in the city, is that when it comes to public speaking, PowerPoint presentations are not well received. Less is better. But then I became a consultant. And in that world, PowerPoint is king. Slides rule, the more the merrier. Last week I was in a client meeting where 250 slides were presented. Yes, 250. So in order to be consistent, I thought I would apply the law of averages today to my presentation. That's just my slide, no more. In reality, no amount of slides could explain what really happened to the oil price in the last 6 months, or what this collapse means for a country like Colombia, which has come so far in the last decade and was counting on the steady and increased flow of oil income to fund its transformation. Numbers, like hips, don't lie. Over the last 5 years, oil and gas investment surpassed $20 billion, represented between 30 to 40% of foreign investment. In taxes and royalties alone, oil and gas development has brought up into state coffers over $24 billion. As the government has been quick to point out, oil and gas income by itself is equal to 12 years of social programs like Familia Acción, which is an important program which is funded to put kids in school, 60% of the massive road infrastructure projects, and Colombia's educational budget. We're talking about significant resources. It is estimated that $1 decline in price has a $200 million impact on fiscal revenues. In 2013, Colombia received $12.5 billion. In 2015, they expect to receive $6.3 billion. That's a cut in half of the resources. In 2013, 29% of our fiscal revenues came from oil. In 2015, expects to be only 11%. So we're talking about a significant change and a big stuff. And to add insult to injury, the Colombian peso has undergone an abrupt weakening. The dollar has appreciated over 25% in the last few months. Understandably, there's been a lot of criticism of the Colombian government for lack of planning. The fact the national budget was bullish on oil, pricing it over $85. But Colombia was not alone. The other day, I found an article in Bloomberg, which had not been taken off the internet because I think they wanted it off, where they predicted in January 2014, at the end of 2014, the price would be $115. So as somebody had said earlier, the ability to predict prices is not that there. But though much hay has been made about the price, Colombia's oil woes preceded the downturn of the market. Even in June, when oil was listed in triple digit, there were signs of trouble, both at home and abroad. The halving of the price just brought these issues to the forefront. In order for Colombia to overcome this predicament, it is critical that these issues be resolved, since unlike the price of crude, these are within the country's control. Now, you may ask yourself, how can an industry that almost doubled its oil production in 7 years be in a crisis? It is true. Colombia, in 2014, averaged over 1 million barrels a day. And that despite the fall in investment, 2015 will be a better year as far as production. But then things get dicey. According to the Colombian Oil Association, in 2016, production could fall by as much as 100,000 barrels a day. And many experts fear that Colombia would lose its self-sufficiency in 7 years. So how do we get here? Like all good stories, this one began with a dire prediction of doom. At the turn of the century, the country faced a certainty, and I say certainty because, as you know, experts are never wrong, that it would have to import oil by 2004. The catastrophe was avoided thanks to a mixed cocktail of smart policy choices and, to be honest, luck. A decision was made to divide up Ecopetrol with the state companies' roles. Since its inception in the 1950s, the state oil company had been both a partner and a regulator. As a jack of all things or a jack of all trades, it frequently forgot its core activity, the exploration, production, transportation, distribution of hydrocarbons. Any similarity to other Latin American companies is not my objective today. In 2003, the government created the National Hydrocarbon Agency, who took over the role of assigning areas, setting commercial terms, and paying royalties. The agency issued better commercial terms that attracted new investment. A few years later, taking a page from Brazil and Petrobras, 10% of Ecopetrol was put on the market, providing the company with necessary capital to turn it into a regional player. All of this, however, does not fully explain Colombia's turnaround. Two external factors, what I call luck because the likelihood of both occurring at the same time is akin to rolling the dice, played a fundamental role. The first was price. The oil went from $25 to $30 to $90 to $100 in the first decade of the century, thus making previously uneconomic projects profitable. The second was the decision by Hugo Chavez, at that time president of Venezuela, to fire the best and the brightest of PDVSA's engineers and geologists. Several of them found a home in Colombia, and they applied their know-how to help generate the heavy oil recovery revolution that supports the industry today. Fields that produced less than 5,000 barrels a day rose to over 100,000. However, and of course there was a however, all good stories have a twist. No industry can survive only with secondary recovery. The fact of the matter is that Colombia has not had a major discovery since Cupiagua in 1993. So exploration and opening of new basins is critical for the long term, and here, unfortunately, problems abound. That brings me back to my earlier comment that the industry faced challenges unrelated to price. Although to state the obvious, that does not help, obviously. Many years ago, somebody in the industry came up with the term LTO, or license to operate, a way of highlighting the technical expertise, that the technical expertise in oil exploration and production was not enough. That companies need to take into account the communities and other stakeholders. And it is this critical area where both the government and the industry are lacking. The industry complains, and does it ever, that the companies are left to fend by themselves in remote regions where community mistrust and activism is on the rise. Colombia is one of the few countries in the world where consultation with indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities is not only mandated by the Constitution, but is actually enforced. Although the Santos administration has tried to streamline the process, the industry remains unhappy and is increasingly vocal in its displeasure and its demands. Just a few weeks ago, when Colombia was just awakening from the December break, Colombians like to rest in December break, the industry laid down its conditions. Contracts need to be renegotiated. We need tax breaks. We need environmental licensing sped up. And they try to make an effort to pressure the government. This, I believe, is a mistake in every current one. I do not dispute that the industry may have a point on all levels. However, Being right does not necessarily translate into action. It can actually backfire. Like in most parts of the world, the oil industry is seen with suspicion and portrayed negatively in the media. So when the industry complains, it generates backlash and loses leverage. Nonetheless, I have been told that the government is seriously looking into the industry's proposals, and some may actually be implemented. But if the industry does not change its tone, it could undermine the government's efforts. As you can see, several of Colombia's problems are not different than other oil-producing countries. However, there is a wild card which only applies to Colombia: the peace negotiations with the FARC and ELN guerrillas. The outcome of these talks can significantly impact the industry. Since the 1980s, the guerrilla groups have attacked oil pipelines, kidnapped workers, murdered workers, extorted companies. The cost has been hundreds of millions of dollars and in dozens of lives. And frankly, it has made it difficult to open up new bases in Colombia. Peace could be a game changer. I say could and not will, because even with better security, there is still no consensus of how to generate the oil income to fund the post-conflict. Most experts believe that the next phase of Colombian oil development will be found in shale. But for many in Colombia, fracking is, I am not exaggerating, the devil's work. This brings me to a Colombian paradox. The most vocal opponents of fracking, the left, NGOs, environmentalists, are at the same time the loudest proponents and defenders of the peace process. Everybody knows that the signing of a peace agreement in La Habana is just the first step, that the hard part is the implementation of the accords. And for that, resources will be critical, and that raising taxes is an expensive and politically fraught solution compared to encouraging oil and gas exploration and development. So there's a unique opportunity in Colombia for two sides who are frequently at odds with each other, the industry and its vocal critics, to come together for a greater good: peace. Will it happen? Sadly, I'm not optimistic. The industry has remained in its protective shell, more interested in complaining than in taking the lead and discussing its importance vis-a-vis peace in the post-conflict. And many defenders of the peace talks remain stranded in 1970s mindset when it comes to multinationals and oil investment. The oil industry in Colombia has survived and prospered in spite of all these difficulties. So peace is not critical for its long-term durability, but it could be the icing on the cake. Muchas gracias.
Alfonso, John, you're up next.
Thank you, David, for your introduction. Ladies and gentlemen. To begin my little speech here, I'd like to first introduce my institute, the Canadian Energy Research Institute. We're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. We're a not-for-profit organization, and we like to think that we are providing relevant, independent, objective economic research in energy and the environment, and actually I believe that. Our mandate is to inform policy, business, media, and the public, and we have sponsorship from the Government of Canada, Government of Alberta, and the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. All of our projects, all of our papers are available online to the public for free, and you can access them at that website there, www.ceri.ca. Let me begin by discussing domestic oil production in North America. Despite the Great Recession that gripped North America only half a decade ago, oil production in Canada and the US has been on the rise. In Canada, the lion's share of this increase has come from expansion in the oil sands. In the US, production has been largely technologically driven, with improved drilling and recovery techniques driving productions in areas such as the Eagle Ford Shale and Permian Basin in Texas and the Bakken Play in North Dakota. In Mexico, however, the story's been different, with an overall decline in production that's been going on for over a decade. In an effort to reverse that trend, the Mexican government has famously and to some controversy decided to open up the long-closed domestic oil and gas industry there to companies based outside the country. Let me begin by speaking to the situation in Canada's oil sands. As you should be able to see from the slide, oil companies in Canada are starting to act to cut capital expenditures and streamline operations. And every day there are new announcements of personnel cuts and project delays. And despite this, CERI, Canadian Energy Research Institute, predicts that growth will continue in the oil sands. It appears that capacity will increase to something just north of 3 million barrels per day in 2020 from just over 2 million barrels per day in 2013. And before the cuts, it appeared capacity would hit 3.4 million barrels per day. Greenfield projects have been delayed, but they will still come online. Right now, I would say the growth trend is somewhere between the reference case and the low case on this slide. The line may flatten out over the next few years if the low oil prices persist, but nothing going on today indicates that growth will not occur in the oil sands. In Canada, low oil prices cause for concern because of the large and growing role that oil has in the national economy. If the strength of the Canadian dollar can serve as a bellwether for the performance of the Canadian oil industry, you can see that the trend has been downward for some time now. This has all caused concern at the federal government level, with the finance minister delaying announcements of the 2015 budget until April to see how the situation plays out. What is not in doubt is that the downtrend in oil price will reduce federal government revenues, as well as revenues in producing provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland. On the bright side, low oil prices help manufacturing, which is mostly concentrated in the central Canadian provinces of Ontario and Quebec. Also on the bright side, the Canadian Parliamentary Budget Officer recently announced that a balanced budget can still be reached at a sustained $48 oil price. So the government's goal of trying to keep the budgets in line looks not to be in jeopardy at the moment. In the US, we've seen a revolution in oil production thanks to shale oil extraction in areas like the Permian Basin in West Texas. And George Bush was prescient in his 2006 State of the Union address when he said that America was addicted to oil, and the way to cure the addiction was through technology. He may not have meant improved oil extraction technology, but that is what the industry is seeing. In the example here, Concho Resources show how their super fracking techniques, improved fracking techniques, have boosted extraction by over 75% over the first 3 months of a typical Permian Basin well. And they have been making these improvements at low cost, and this sort of activity has been going out throughout this very highly technical, highly innovative industry. IHS CERA tells us that as much as half of this US oil is economic at $60 prices. As technology continues to improve, you can expect US companies to stay in the game longer, continuing to produce. So, after oil bottoms out, which we hope, most people in the room I think hope happens soon, what happens then? $100 oil, do we go back? Does it slingshot back up? And here on this slide we have 3 different prognosticators saying different stories about the price of oil. On the one side, there's the Saudi prince proclaiming $100 a barrel oil will never happen again. On the other side, a prominent US oilman insists that $100 oil is going to happen again. And in the middle, we have a historian saying the future can hold anything. If you think that the oil story is a supply and demand story, then what T. Boone Pickens, the oilman, says is persuasive. When supply is constrained, the price goes up. However, Daniel Yergin, the historian, says that geopolitics plays a role, as do other things. I read a persuasive article last night by an analyst who says that the oil price inevitably tracks the US dollar inversely, and that the price of oil follows US monetary and fiscal policy. So in other words, when the US follows a strong dollar policy, the price of oil goes down. This was the case in the Reagan and the Clinton eras. When the oil follows a weak dollar policy, the price of oil, when the US follows a weak dollar policy, the price of oil goes up. And this has been the case more or less so far in the Bush and Obama eras. So the US dollar has strengthened in recent months, and the price of oil has plummeted, which lends some degree of credence to this theory. On this slide, this is the price of oil in real terms over the past, since 1973. And you can see that it's had its high moments before, but it seems that the price, even when it dips, is significantly higher than it was. So over the long haul, there are many factors that affect the price of oil, and the CERI view is this. First of all, low oil prices are cyclical. They're not structural. Global oil demand has increased 11% in the past decade, even though the world has seen high oil prices and one of the deepest recessions in history. And we've seen a downturn for three main reasons. I've listed them here. Supply is outpacing demand by over 1 million barrels per day. On top of that, there's a lot that's been stored as well. Efficiencies, number two, efficiencies in production and in end use have increased in recent years. And number three, there is always geopolitical uncertainty in the world. But the world has lived with Syria and ISIS for several years now. Geopolitics are a cause for concern, but not surprise. I would say that the evidence is clear that we're nearing the end of an era of cheap oil, as I mentioned to you, the last slide indicates. Though we consider $45 as $45 oil as cheap compared to what we've seen in recent years, a decade ago, $45 oil would have been seen as a very, very high price indeed. Industrialization is occurring rapidly throughout the world, and demand is coming from places like China where none existed before. Even a recessionary China represents massive oil demand. The IEA states global demand will increase by 7% over the next 5 years. On the supply side, technical innovation will assist high-cost producers lower their costs. But more supply will be needed to meet demand. 5 years from now, the recent oil price plunge will be seen as a dip in a trend that is moving onward and upward. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, John. Duncan.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Great pleasure to be here speaking with you. I seem to spend a lot of my life in Mexico and in Texas talking about exactly this issue. Every couple of weeks I seem to be giving a conference in Houston, San Antonio, Austin, or Dallas. And in between, I'm in Mexico City doing the same thing and doing the research that makes it possible to do this. And to be honest with you, the story on Mexico had become a little bit dull recently because there was so much good news. The story about the oil reform was so positive. They were doing everything right. Everything was going their way. And of course, this was going to be a big success. And as much as the oil industry, as it likes to do, was saying, be careful, don't get carried away, the Mexican government seemed to be responding so well to this process all the way along. And then low oil prices began to have their effect upon the process. And that's part of what I want to talk about today. I've been asked by David to also talk about the impact upon the government and the budget, and also want to talk about the impact of low oil prices on Pemex, the national oil company, which is going through a period of extraordinary change right now as it adapts to the possibility, at least, of a competitive environment. I'm really delighted that John mentioned that historically $45 a barrel is not low oil prices. I remember when I lived in Mexico, I was there for 17 years. I remember when the oil price hit less than $7 a barrel for Mayan crude. And literally it was costing almost as much to get it out of the ground as it was that you could sell it on the markets. But the Mexicans kept pumping away regardless. And I think that tells us something about the mentality of Mexican oil policy, and in particular of the national oil company. Pemex, the national oil company, produces oil. It doesn't think about shareholder value. It doesn't think about whether it's doing it efficiently. Its job, its mandate is to produce oil and sell those barrels on international markets. And that plays in here, which I'll come back to in a second. But let me hit upon this first factor, this perfect storm that we're seeing brewing in Mexico that is impacting upon so many elements of government policy and in particular the energy reform process. The first factor that we see here is how low oil prices are impacting upon government fiscal revenue. As many of you may know, the Mexican government historically has brought in very, very little revenue from the general economy. In fact, it has one of the lowest tax takes of any OECD country. Around 11% of GDP comes in tax revenue from non-oil sources. This means that the Mexican government has historically relied very, very heavily upon oil as a source of fiscal revenue. Up to 30 or even in some cases 35% of the national budget has come from oil. Now that means that the Mexican government depends upon this for not only its overall functioning, but for social programs, infrastructure spending, etc. Over the past 10 years, as John showed us, the Mexican oil production has experienced a precipitous decline, down from 3.4 million barrels a day in 2004 to around 2.4 million barrels a day today. The loss of 1 million barrels a day of production. Now, they were very lucky during that period because, of course, there was a high oil price. And so the high oil price, to some degree, compensated for that lost production, and revenue continued to come in. But now we have sort of the worst of both worlds. We have a situation where you have a serious decline in oil production, and you have a low oil price. And this is beginning to hit upon Mexican government revenue in a serious way. The Mexican government has been trying to prepare itself for this by embarking upon an ambitious fiscal reform process, which it put in place in the fall of 2013. Unfortunately, that was not only politically very unpopular, it hasn't been successful enough. They've brought in a little bit of extra revenue, but sadly the Mexican economy hasn't been performing at a high enough rate to be able to generate enough revenue for the Mexican government to compensate for what they would see as this declining revenue from oil. However, there are many people in the Mexican government, as some of you in this room will know, who are extremely smart. And one of those people is the governor of the central bank, Agustin Carstens. Now, Agustin Carstens, for a number of years now, has taken the precautionary step of hedging the oil price in Mexico for government revenue. This means that for 2015, the Mexican government hedged the price of oil at $79 a barrel. That was a very, very smart thing to do. Jane asked the question earlier on, who could have guessed that oil prices would have fallen? Well, Agustin Carstens has been betting and guessing that for a number of years. And in this case, it has really paid off. Because for 2015, the Mexican government has its fiscal revenue more or less guaranteed at that $79 a barrel rate. That is of enormous help at this point in time. But it only applies for 2015. In 2016, they won't be able to hedge at that price again. Of course not. And so what we're looking at moving ahead is that the Mexican government is going to have to cancel a lot of its long-term spending projects. And that's exactly what we've seen in the past couple of weeks. We've seen major infrastructure projects, the building of train links between Mexico City and Querétaro, a city about 2 hours to the north. A rail link across the Yucatan Peninsula has been cancelled, and a number of other projects. The Mexican government has said that it's committed to building the new Mexico City airport, which is a $9–10 billion project, because it sees that as being crucial to the economic future of the country. But the Mexican government hasn't begun to cancel social projects at this point in time. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, because we're looking at midterm elections in Mexico in the summer of this year. And beginning to cut back on social spending would be politically disadvantageous for the government. The economic impact of the low oil price beyond just government revenue is important to take into consideration as well. The oil sector accounts for between 8 and 10% of the Mexican economy today. That's down from around 40% of Mexican GDP 20 years ago, but it is still a significant percentage of the economy. And as the oil price begins to fall and as spending begins to fall as well, there's going to be obviously a spillover effect into the construction sector, for example, and to the services sector. And at the same time as all of this is going on, the Mexican government is undergoing a crisis of legitimacy due to challenges not just on the public security, rule of law front, but of course on questions of conflict of interest and corruption. This is going to be an incredibly difficult year for the Mexican government, and the low oil price is just exacerbating that problem. If we move on to the question of the national oil company, Pemex, as I mentioned to you earlier on, Pemex has experienced a difficult decade. It's seen its production decline dramatically. But Pemex is also going through an extraordinary change as it adapts to the possibility of an energy reform process that exposes it to competition for the first time in the domestic environment. It has to face competition from better financed, more efficient, more competitive foreign oil companies. It has to go through an entire reform of its internal business culture to try to actually generate a business culture for the first time. Senior figures at Pemex will often tell you, they say, our biggest challenge is actually internal. How do we get our workers to think as though they are actually workers in an oil company as opposed to a government ministry? They have challenges in terms of human capital. They're going to experience a mass extinction, a massive retirement wave of engineers and technicians over the next few years. As many as 10,000 petroleum engineers and technicians are going to retire, and they don't know how they're going to fill those staffing positions. The good news for Pemex is that Pemex is fortunate in that the reserves that Mexico has mean that it can produce oil at around $23 a barrel. Now, in some of its older fields, you can produce it at as low as $7 or $8 a barrel, but on average, they're looking at $23 a barrel. That means that the oil price has a long way to go until it doesn't make sense for Pemex to produce oil. However, it means that the company has a lot less money, a lot less cash than it had before. And while we're talking about cash, it's interesting that at the beginning of the year, just after Christmas, the Mexican government went into Pemex and took $3.4 billion in cash out of the petty cash of the company, as it were. A cash grab that the Mexican government said it needed to finance its fiscal program. And to make things even worse, because of the low oil price and declining government revenue, the Mexican government has just announced that Pemex's budget is going to be slashed for this year. The company is in a really, really desperate situation at this point, and it's going to be very difficult for it to turn things around. And this brings us to the last point, the energy reform and the reform process. As I said, this was a very successful process until December of 2014, just a couple of months ago, when Mexico announced the contract terms for the first round of bidding in the energy reform for new contracts. The immediate reaction was more or less positive, but then companies got actually a hold of the documents and they began to look at the terms, and they said, these are supposed to be E&P contracts. They're supposed to be production sharing contracts, but they look much more like a services contract, and we can't do business like this. And the pushback is beginning to happen. And just as Alfonso mentioned, of course this is part of the nature of the public-private relationship. But in this case, it's very much if you don't adapt the terms of these contracts, we're not in. And so the energy reform, or at least the first round of the energy reform process, will be a failure. So far, thus far, only 7 companies have actually bought into the data rooms. That is where they can actually review the seismic data to make sure that the oil reserve is worth investing in. If you only have 7 companies going in and you've got around 14 fields on offer, this doesn't look good. This is hardly an overwhelming vote of confidence. The disappointing response from the private sector, however, is only going to get worse. And already the big IOCs are preparing their official response to the government. The government is going to have to move. This government has placed so much importance on the energy reform process. It is a legacy issue for the current president. And if round 1 of the bidding of the contract process is a failure, this will look extremely bad. Play this into the midterm elections that will happen in June of this year, and that looks very nasty for the government. And perhaps even beyond that, we need to say that Mexicans are still unconvinced about the energy reform process. 40% of Mexicans still oppose it, and around 34% of Mexicans say they're in favor of it. With the low oil price, people are going to say, well, didn't we go through a reform to bring in more money for the company, for the country? Already I've had requests or interview requests from journalists who have said, doesn't this prove that the energy reform is a failure? And I said, well, hang on a second. This is a global phenomenon. This is hardly anything to do, with the Mexican government or the reform process. But already those public perceptions are out there. And this is why the Mexican government is going to have to make moves to actually bring in more interest. To conclude, let me just say that in the case of Mexico, the low oil price will therefore drive the government to change the contract terms, to make them more friendly to business. It's going to place Pemex under greater strain than it's under already. And it's going to negatively impact the popularity of both the reform process and further damage the reputation of the Enrique Peña Nieto government in Mexico. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, panel. While I'm going to have a little conversation with these guys first, while those of you think of questions, if you're watching this from elsewhere, get in a Twitter question or get your cards in from the overflow rooms. Duncan sort of went in a direction I'd like to go with the rest of you politically. He talked about the midterm elections, and John, I wonder if you could sort of, does the lower price of oil have an effect on domestic tranquility in Canada? Not like problems that we'd see in other parts of the world, but what's happening there, and what about relations with the United States? And then Alfonso, would like to ask you if you could sort of dip into Venezuela a little bit. So, John?
Well, I think the short answer to your question is it doesn't really upset the tranquility in the country. There are other things that upset it well enough. I think people understand that this is a global issue, and they understand it's a market issue with the price going down. Nobody goes to blame the Harper government or the Prentice government in Alberta for low oil prices. So I think Canadians watch developments with concern, but aren't looking for a scapegoat yet.
Does this tip the power balance in Canada from the west to the east?
Well, as long as this persists, you will see, as I mentioned in my presentation, that it should help manufacturing in Ontario and Quebec because of the lower price of the lower prices help them with their feedstock costs, and so but it will cause. It's been estimated about an $8 billion. The government will be bringing in about $8 billion less this year in revenue because of the low oil price. So I don't know if we're at the point of wholesale cuts to programs yet. If that starts to happen, then the opposition could be looking a lot more appealing.
You want to venture to the United States a little bit? Well, Duncan can do that later. Alfonso.
Well, I mean, I think it's difficult to find a country in the world which is more affected by the fall of the price of oil than Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela, it's producing the same it produced 15 years ago. We're on 2.2 million. Their ability to, so the fact that it's fallen just shows the desperation of the government. The government's in a very difficult side. President Maduro did a tour through Russia and through China looking for support, and he kind of wanted to replicate what President Chavez did in 1999. We went around and was able to get agreement to build that. But now he found very little support there. So there's a very difficult situation here. They have their dependence on oils, and it's affecting day to day about how it's going to work. Their reserves are going down. I mean, they're in a very difficult situation here. But Venezuela is one of the type of countries that if they were to change policies, I know people want to imagine that, would have an incredible big impact because they have, they have the reserve, they have the whole situation about that. But right now, it's a very critical situation for President Maduro. There's increasing protests. It's a very difficult time right there, and the fact that that he didn't get any support from his good friends in China and other areas, which he was counting on, kind of shows us that it's going to be very critical months for Venezuela.
Yes, since we are in North America, Western Hemisphere, Duncan, do you want to say something about the United States? And then what I'm going to do is turn to my colleague, Paulo Sotero, I see in the audience here, who's going to, I think just a couple sentences from him on Brazil would be really helpful to this conversation. So,
yeah, there's a number of dimensions here. Obviously, we're seeing that the rig count in North America in general has been dropping recently, and the number of rigs that are going out into fracking or shale plays has first stabilized and is declining. And as John laid out very, very clearly, there's some operators that are either able to maintain their operations at this point in time at this lower oil price, or are actively working on making the process cheaper, and you'll see them surviving. There's others who are going to pull out for a while, but I think the key thing is that you can't uninvent fracking technology. It's there. It's kind of like the conversation we had over lunch about nuclear technology. It's not that people are going to unlearn it. So as soon as the oil price begins to go back up again, it's quite easy to go back into these fields and to begin work again. And of course, if you've already invested in your shale play, then you've already put in a huge amount of capital expenditure in there, and you've got sunken costs. You continue to you have to continue producing oil from that play in order to be able to pay back the bank, the financer, and also to be able to try to make a little bit of money. So I am far from being sort of all doom and gloom on this from the American point of view. And I think that on the North American perspective, the process that we saw beginning in December of last year, where the three energy ministers got together here in DC, that was a great moment. And a momentous occasion in the sense that now we are beginning to see the possibility of a mechanism by which the three governments can come together and plan for exactly this eventuality. Back in the early 2000s, there was something called the North American Energy Working Group, where the three experts from the three countries got together to discuss things like the impact of low oil prices or high oil prices. We need to have that kind of coordination again. And it's one of the issues that over the next 12 months, the energy ministers and their staffs will begin to take on, and to define ways in which they can approach this and ways in which they can actually take advantage perhaps of this. Because let's not forget that low oil prices are very much an opportunity as well, not just for the rest of the economy, but for the oil industry itself.
Paulo, a couple years ago we were thinking of Brazil pre-salt. Brazil was going to be another energy power, and things have changed in Brazil and the price has gone down. Can you just give us a little sketch of what's going on there?
Well, Brazil is producing some,
You're on.
yeah, it's producing some 2 million barrels of oil a day. It's projected to produce 5 in about 5 years, 5 million barrels of oil a day, which would put Brazil in the fifth or sixth position. In the short term, the prices of oil falling is beneficial to Brazil because given the mix of oils that we import and export right now, it saves Brazil about $2 billion a year right now in the very short term. The question is when the pre-salt oil, which is offshore deep under the ocean oil, comes into line, it's starting, well, it is the view that the calculation is that it's below $40 a barrel, it becomes a complicated equation. But the most important event right now, this is all theoretical in Brazil because what's happening in Brazil regarding oil sector is a huge corruption scandal that is starting to produce enormous repercussions for the whole economy, for Petrobras. The president of Petrobras resigned yesterday. There will be new management next Monday, coming mostly from the private sector. There are two silver linings in this story. One is that the corruption scandal was revealed by actions of the federal police in Brazil and by a young generation of public prosecutors. And there will not be a political compromise on that. It's already been, that is pretty clear and unacceptable in Brazil today. The second positive aspect of this is that the scandal happens because Petrobras, that was a very well-run company, was taken over politically. And it was basically assaulted by groups of senior officials of Petrobras, politically appointed, and by a series of very corrupt executives from suppliers companies, construction companies, etc. So the debate in Brazil today is going in the direction that as the lesson of this is that you have to go for a less statist view of the development of this area. You have to open up in order to fulfill the targets or the objectives Petrobras has set for itself. It cannot rely on the national content regulations it established in 2007 when the regulatory framework of the oil industry in Brazil was changed from what President Cardoso had established when he was in power. And so it is expected that as a sort of consequences of this very sad episode that the Brazil oil sector will tend to open up to more foreign participation, because that is important to fulfill the objectives of the policy of reaching the 5 million barrels a
Okay,
day.
so I guess we stay tuned then. One more question from me, and it's something that none of you mentioned, and I'd like to throw out there. What is this, and I think it's more important in the Western Hemisphere that we're looking at, the role of renewables in climate change. No one said anything, and I'm just going to throw it at you like that. Does this have an effect on increasing emissions, obviously increased use of fuel? We've seen it go up in the United States, particularly in the auto sector. Are we getting away from this? Is there any hope that we're going to cut our use of carbons, or are we just going to go full steam ahead?
Let me just say something about the case of Mexico. On the, I think it was the 15th of January, the Energy Minister, Minister Caldwell, announced that Mexico would be investing $14.4 billion in wind energy in the country over the next few years. We're seeing wind energy production in the country going up dramatically, another 750 megawatts being added by the end of this year from a base of around 2,300 megawatts that exists in the country today. Mexico has committed a large part of its power future, electricity generation future, to renewables. And part of that is because of now a well-established recognition that Mexico is an incredibly vulnerable country to climate change. Its long coastlines, its tropical, subtropical geography, and the fact that a lot of people still live in poverty mean that when you have extreme weather events in Mexico, it has a very, very deep impact upon the lives of people and on the economy. And so it's clear that Mexico is committed to the renewables path. But in terms of reducing emissions, I think that's something which we're going to see, regardless of the low oil price, is going to be something that we're going to see on a North American basis. We're seeing automobile manufacturers that have gradually changed their standards, and those standards are becoming regional standards. That's going to be built into the production process on a North American basis from this point on. We're seeing consumer groups that are demanding cleaner air within cities, and cleaner air often feeds into the question of improving not just the local environment, but the global environment. So I think that for Mexico, this is not going to be a major factor. It's not going to push Mexico away from the path that it's on already. The question is, I think, more on the global basis about whether low oil prices do in fact encourage people to buy gas guzzlers again. Is that where we're at? I want to believe that people have learned, and that regardless of what the oil price is, they like saving money. But in fact, what do you see out there? Well, you see people making all kinds of excuses, like I did this weekend. I was up in Toronto, there was a heavy snowfall. What did I rent? I rented a Jeep Wrangler Sahara. The name made me feel warmer, and the vehicle was good in the snow. But I filled up that thing after a weekend, $65 Canadian. What's that, around $20 American these days? Something like that. But anyway, it was yeah, sorry guys. But it was an extraordinary, it was like, really, that's all? And unfortunately, those kind of choices are what people are going to be making, I think.
I think in the Canadian economy, renewables have a role. It's a small role, and I think it will continue to be a small role for the foreseeable future. Running an economy in a country with the climate of Canada and with the industrial requirements of Canada on anything other than hydrocarbons is quite a tall task. People don't want to be converting to nuclear energy, for example. People, all of the major river systems have been dammed for to get hydroelectricity. There aren't a lot of options out there yet. As soon as the options are out there, and as soon as they become economical, and as soon as they become physically realistic in that kind of a climate, in that kind of a country, you're going to have to wait a while before renewables become embraced.
In Colombia, the energy, our energy is hydro, so there's not the issue of that impact. And in Colombia, different because of the way the basket, the issue of the low gas prices in Colombia never go down, which drives people crazy because they have like a basket, they never go down. So there's been no impact on the price situation. So I think that in that sense, you're not going to see it. I mean, there's a lot of talk about renewables, about that. There's interest in maybe of increasing gas, like natural gas instead of coal. We don't really, we produce coal, but we don't actually use it. So there's not a sense of one doesn't see like a big change there, right? But I think that as the price of gas goes down, I think people are going to be getting bigger cars and traveling more, and air travel is going to go up. So I don't think people have learned this big lesson when it applies to them directly. When it applies to theoretically, yes, but I think that I do think that the low price will actually increase oil consumption in general.
Okay, now it's time for questions. Anybody? Over here.
What do you see the effect of low prices for hydrocarbons having on Keystone Pipeline? And if your country relies on hydrocarbons, would you, if Keystone doesn't go through, send it east or west, or use it internally?
I think it's too early to tell, really, with low oil prices, what effect it'll have on Keystone. I think TransCanada is committed to going forward with that pipeline, but I think it's a political issue now in the United States rather than an issue of oil prices in Canada. There are other means of getting oil to market, and over the last several years, they've become these other means have been used more often. You've got crude by rail, for example, that is just booming now. You have expansion of existing pipelines. So you have reversal of pipelines that are going in one direction, going into another direction. And you have conversion of gas pipelines to oil pipelines. All of those things have been happening, and all of those things have been moving oil to markets where they weren't, where it wasn't there before. I think the Keystone XL pipeline would be a very safe, cost-effective way of moving Canadian crude to refineries on the Gulf Coast, but it's not necessary to bring Canadian crude to markets in the United States and elsewhere.
Can I just one thing on this. One of the aspects we haven't talked about is that there is an emerging competition between Canadian crude and Mexican crude. Of a similar grade by the time that Canadian crude has gone through its synthetic process. And when the price of oil was $100 or $80 a barrel, the price difference wasn't that much in terms of a percentage. But when you're down around the $40 a barrel mark, saving $6 a barrel or $4 a barrel actually makes a difference. And we're beginning to see that play out, and the Mexican authorities are looking at ways in which they can find alternative markets now for some of their extra heavy crude that they're trying to place, because it's not a guaranteed marketplace in the United States anymore.
The Mayan crude in Mexico has the one advantage that they have over the Western Canadian Select crude, which is what comes out of Canada. Those are both identical crudes in terms of their properties, but they have access to tidewater, and they can ship their crude throughout the world. And Canada is at Canada has to rely on the beneficence of their neighbor to the south for pricing, and so the Mexicans have been able to gain a higher price for the Mayan crude, and that's continuing.
I have a question from one of the other rooms that came in, and it's kind of related to this. Well, one was what was the role of NAFTA, but how to tackle the infrastructure challenges in the region. And I think that's Keystone is not just itself a pipeline, it's part of a huge infrastructure network. And can we invest in that with lower prices? And infrastructure in Latin America as well. So let's take that to the next level on infrastructure. Are we going to see less invested there?
I mean, I think that we have a regional infrastructure challenge at the moment, which is that there's the problem of pipelines, there's a problem of transmission lines, there's a problem of refineries. What we're seeing is that in some parts of the region, and if I look at the case of Mexico, the lack of access to natural gas in Mexico has really impacted on economic competitiveness. Mexico hasn't benefited from low gas prices over the past few years because it hasn't had access through pipelines to the US supply. Those pipelines are now being built, and those projects which are underway will continue to be built because it's in the national economic interest to make that happen. In fact, bringing in these cheaper products into Mexico and the lower prices that we're seeing makes it extra important. In terms of diversifying markets in Mexico, the question that we were just talking about, it is very, very important that Mexico begins to invest in not just the infrastructure needed for the energy reform and bringing in new investment there for exploration and production, but in new port facilities, for example, in new paving of roads. Look at the challenge that exists up in the north of Mexico. If the shale revolution is ever to take place in northern Mexico, you've got to put in some infrastructure there. There's no access to water, there's no roads there. You've got to put in sort of basic services. So I think that regardless, we're going to see the infrastructure picture in Mexico continue to improve, but the government can't be the one that's going to do it. Because as I said in my presentation, there's less money available in the national budget now. And so that we're going to have to look increasingly to public-private partnerships, and we're going to have to look at the private sector putting in more cash itself. And that's where we may begin to see sort of the real challenge.
John, you mentioned earlier getting Canadian oil to Tidewater, reversal of pipelines, but these aren't slam dunks.
Nope, that's true. And no pipeline has been a slam dunk for quite some time in Canada. The one pipeline that goes that they're planning on running from the Edmonton area in Alberta to the British Columbia coast, the Northern Gateway pipeline, that's been in the works since 2002. That's when it was first proposed, and there's been hurdle after hurdle after hurdle. Some having to do with raising money, some having to do with environmental groups, some having to do with the First Nations peoples objecting to the pipeline going ahead. That one's not dead in the water yet, and my feeling is that if the company that's been, if companies that are willing to put in 10, 12 years into a project like that, they're going to see it to the very end, whether it goes or not. That particular project, Northern Gateway, I feel will probably eventually wind up getting decided in Canada's Supreme Court. So you're right, these are not slam dunk projects. But the crude by rail certainly has been quite effective over the past little while. The infrastructure there already exists. Wherever you've got a train line, you can pretty much move that crude there.
And so the lower price of oil, does that encourage or?
It's expensive.
Well, it's expensive, but with yeah.
It's expensive to ship by rail as well. You know,
You're losing margin there?
Yeah, you're losing margin. Yeah. What I'm saying is there are options. They may not be cheap, but there are options.
One of the big challenges with the region, with all this, the low oil price, is the issue of the Caribbean. As you know, the Caribbean has been for many years subsidized by Venezuela. Venezuela is giving all types of oil and is giving all that. This scenario now just seems, politically, Venezuela will try to keep it as long as it possibly can, but I think there is a real concern about how that's going to connect and how you're going to replace that. I think this is a real geopolitical issue for the U.S. because if the situation in Caribbean, if the situation, if they're not able to subsidize, if they don't have energy and all that, and the prices go back up again, there could be a lot of problems in the Caribbean. So I think that's one of the challenges the region, which is being generated by the difficulties Venezuela has today.
Yeah, and the energy ministers were meeting here last week, at Caribbean energy ministers. So
That's right.
in the middle here.
I'd like to ask you a question about the influence of the financial barrels of oil versus physical barrels of oil, because the price of oil has actually increased about, what, 12% in the last 4 days or so, the WTI. And someone had to be on the other side of that 2 million barrels of hedged Mexican oil at $79. So could you talk about the effect of the financial markets, financial barrels versus physical barrels?
Do you want to take that one?
I'll allow you to do that one. I can say right now that the markets are jittery, and that has there's some fluctuation happening now, which I don't know is based on economic fundamentals, but of a jittery market. So I think that the rise that you've seen in the last few days, I think that may, over the long term, we may not have hit bottom yet. I think that the financial folks are hoping against hope that we have, and maybe that's reflected in the recent upturn.
My answer sort of takes us back to when oil prices hit $150 a barrel, you know, and we were all saying then, is that really where we're going? We're going to go to $200 a barrel, and a lot of that was speculation. There's clearly a lot of work going on in financial markets to say, how can we get hold of barrels ahead of time to lock in a price because we're betting that the price is going to go higher. In this case, is it that, look, this is a temporary low, it's going to bounce back up, and so therefore we want to lock it in as low as we can, and that extra demand on the futures market has brought the price up? Unfortunately, I don't know the answers to that, but I would strongly suspect that that's the case, absolutely, because that's what we see every time. And whether it is, the price is going up or the price is going down and people thinking that's a temporary situation, it's always going to be a factor at play there. Now, in the case of Mexico, that $79 a barrel price that they got, I want to know who was the guy who made that deal on the other side. But let's face it, there were probably lots of people who would have made that deal on the other side a year ago, because nobody really predicted this. Nobody saw it coming. And somebody's sitting there right now sort of lamenting the fact that they didn't have a crystal ball. But that's the financial markets. It's a casino, right? You're gambling.
Question from one of the rooms outside here. This is Duncan. Will the continued uncertainty in Mexican oil production offset low prices and lead to another immigration wave into the United States? Tie those together.
Wow. A different kind of perfect storm. So on the on the question of sort of the instability in Mexico, the instability in oil prices, Mexico's going through a very, very difficult time right now, despite the great news on the reform process over the past 2 years that we've experienced. And the overall optimism about the Mexican economy, despite disappointing performance for the last 2 years. The fact is that Mexico faces a number of very, very serious governance challenges. And those governance challenges are obviously to do with the rule of law, citizen security, and institutional capacity. The low oil price that we're seeing playing into this, as I mentioned in my talk, is going to play out in terms of damaging government popularity, in terms of public opinion. It's already very, very low in the polls. But I was looking at some figures just this morning, and in fact it seems that every single politician in Mexico is very poorly evaluated at this point in time. The president is not the worst of them all, it seems. People are saying it's a historic low. He's down at around 37, 38% popularity rate right now, but a lot of other senior politicians are rated even lower than him. But this is a very serious legitimacy crisis for the Mexican government right now. They're facing attacks from many different fronts. On the economic front, playing into immigration, if the Mexican economy were to collapse tomorrow, would we see waves of immigration? Well, it's possible, but the fact is that the Mexican economy isn't going to collapse tomorrow. It's a very, very strong economy. It's a manufacturing economy. Never forget, the Mexican economy exports more manufactured goods than the rest of Latin America combined. That's a strong economy. This is a powerhouse. And the low oil price is not going to damage that economy. It's going to help that economy. Low energy prices help that economy. But let's just imagine that there was. If we play that sort of, hypothetical game, you have to have people to migrate. That's one of the basic facts of migration, is people to do it. And Mexico's demographic bubble is working its way through. You don't have the young people that you had from a few years ago. Look at how many people have been migrating from Mexico to the United States in recent years. It's a tiny fraction of what it was in the mid-2000s. We're not going to see that human wave of Mexicans again. The simple reason is the Mexicans aren't there. There are less young people, they're more embedded in their community, there are better opportunities in Mexico, and the fact is that the fertility rate of Mexicans is exactly the same as it is in the United States. We've had the big boom of Mexicans coming through, and now Mexico wants to take advantage of that youth, which is becoming young professionals, and the challenge now is to educate them so they have decent jobs. That's really what we're seeing, and that's the challenge that many people in the government and in society are really trying to take on at this point.
Question over here.
Sure, thanks. The story of the tremendous growth in South America over the last decade was precisely the boom in commodity prices, not just oil and gas, but also copper and iron ore and soy. Now, of course, that's all gone down, not just the price of oil, but commodity prices in general. And the boom in the extractive sector gave rise to unprecedented social conflicts around those industries throughout the hemisphere. I don't think there's a country in South America that hasn't experienced some of that. So I was wondering if Alfonso could elaborate a little bit more on the experience of Colombia in mitigating those conflicts and coming to agreements between companies, the government, and local communities so that the extraction goes out in a more sustainable way.
Well, I think Colombia is still trying to do that. I think, as I mentioned in my talk, I mean, Colombia has all types of different rules for consultations, for different communities to kind of involve in all that. And it's still a really big issue because I said there's still a lot of distrust about the multinationals investing in extractive industries. Colombia's done an effort to try to make it close to try to generate that. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that where you have strong institutions, it's easier to have this discussion. But when discussion is going on in remote areas where oil is extracted, you still have this type of pressure and this type of sense about that. And I think it's going to continue. I mean, I think the fact that there is, as you increase in general for Latin America, the more and more you increase citizen participation, and more the companies who are investing in these urban areas, multinationals, it's going to be more and more a challenge for the industry to see how they manage that. They need to kind of understand what I was talking about earlier, that they need to understand that their license to operate will be becoming much more, because they have to be more willing to come in to make early investments and not try to arrive. I think that's going to be one of the big challenges now when people come in, about how these companies deal with the communities and how they and how they manage this risk. But I think Colombia, has had some successes, but I think the demands are not going to stop even if the oil price has gone down. I think the people demand is going to go out. It's going to be harder for the companies to actually respond to the demands. I think there's going to be a very critical issue in Colombia and other parts.
Last question up here.
Everyone agrees that Venezuela is a basket case, but the question is, what, if anything, will it take to turn Venezuela around and make it start functioning again, or is that simply an impossibility?
Briefly.
Well, briefly, I mean, I think predicting what's going to happen, like for Venezuela, is like predicting the price of oil. It's people, it's very difficult. People are afraid to see what's going to happen. I mean, some people say, well, the government cannot continue like this in 6 months. It's got to go. Or it can go for several years. I think that the way the Venezuelan experience just kind of just shows you that with the lack of, you don't have the strong institutions. It's incredible what a country that in 15 years could change about that. But I think it's really difficult to predict about how they're going to do that. I mean, obviously there's still a lot of cash in the economy. There's still a lot of people, interest groups are still into that. So I think the change that one can expect in Venezuela would be different. But regarding oil, I think obviously if there was a change in policy someday in Venezuela, I think that you would see an excitement much even greater than there was when Mexico made its energy reform, and people would kind of go in there. But I think it's very uncertain. And being in Colombia, where we have this, people seem to forget that we have this 2,000-kilometer border with Venezuela. We watched that, and one of the concerns Colombians has is what if Venezuela collapses? Talking about migration of people, as you mentioned, how are you going to manage that? So I think there is a lot of concern about how that's going. But predicting is very difficult to see how things can go.
Okay, before I give my thanks, I want to say we will break for 15 minutes. We'll be back here promptly at 3:15, whether you're here or not. There will be coffee. Drink quickly. You cannot bring coffee back in here. We'll also post the slides and any links that people, to references that people made on our website soon. And with that, let me thank you, Duncan, John, and Alfonso, for giving us your views on Mexico, Canada, and Colombia.
Nice job, guys.